development of the movement in the context of economic and political crisis, the climate emergency, and now the pandemic. I've been especially interested in how the degrowth movement and the idea of collapsology have contributed to a growing interest in the conceptual foundations of permaculture in addition to its more practical, grounded expressions. One marker of that interest has been the sales of the French edition of Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which had sold more than 10,000 copies late last year. That's the most for any of the translations of that book, which many will recognise as not the most accessible permaculture text. The second equally important marker was our collaboration with Sébastien Marot when he was teaching in Australia, and for his major exhibition at the 2019 Lisbon Architecture Triennale, Agriculture and Architecture, Taking the Countryside, which positions permaculture as central to the long overdue reunion of these two most critical expressions of what we call permaculture. But in line with my recent focus on permaculture as a practical solution for citizens grappling with a rapidly changing context, I'm pleased to make this presentation about retrosuburbia, a theme and strategy that I've been articulating for more than a decade. So, I need to share the screen. Can you allow me to do that? So while I'm getting that up, so you can see my presentation. Can I do that now? It says the host has...
Hey David, yeah, we can hear you. It's working fine on our side.
Yeah, I think retrosuburbia is even more relevant now in our pandemic times.
We can see it, thank you.
Good. Okay. Yeah, so I think this work, which has been a focus for more than a decade, is now highly relevant in the pandemic. My context for this work is the Mediterranean climate region of southeastern Australia, where the majority of our 25 million people mostly live in low-density residential areas around our capital cities, regional towns, and even villages such as Hepburn Springs, where I've lived for the last 35 years. So that's 120 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, Australia's second largest city. This is Dja Dja Wurrung country that, like the rest of Australia, was never ceded by the Indigenous people, who were displaced and dispersed by squatters, that is illegal graziers, in the 1840s, and from the 1850s by a surging population exploiting the world's richest gold region. And context is important in understanding the relevance of retrosuburbia in other contexts, including in France. Living with uncertainty in all things is part of the global shared experience in which we apply permaculture ethics and design principles to diverse and varied places and contexts. So I trust that at the very least my presentation will encourage you in your own efforts to find harmonious responses to the challenges you face. And beyond this minimal expectation, hopefully many of the strategies in the book can be adapted to your local context. Let's see. I like to explain permaculture as a design system for sustainable living and land use, rather than just a cool form of organic gardening, as it is commonly understood, at least in this country. While the strategies and techniques vary with place and context, foundational ethics and design principles govern, guide, and inform those strategies and techniques. Permaculture design can be applied to most areas of life and work. The permaculture flower organises the scope of permaculture action in 7 domains. The domain of land and nature stewardship, including gardening and animal husbandry, is the primary domain where we learn the design principles from a working relationship with nature, which we then apply in the other domains that similarly need redesign for a sustainable and just society. At the household level, we simplify those 7 domains to 3 fields of action: the built, the biological, and the behavioural. So retrosuburbia is a pattern language of retrofitting the built, biological and behavioural fields of suburban households, all governed and empowered by permaculture ethics and design principles. The pandemic has highlighted the importance of the household non-monetary economy as a strong base to support us when the monetary economy fails for whatever reason. I think it's shown that a fair proportion of the monetary economy is unnecessary and inefficient in providing for needs that can be done better at home. Commuting each day to work, school and entertainment has been shown to be unnecessary for many. I think it's also shown that single-person households are inefficient and often lonely without all the support of the commute and consume economy. I think on the opposite side, it's shown that multi-generation households are the way that most people will survive and thrive challenging futures, as already demonstrated by the pandemic. I want to talk briefly about the lineage of this retro-suburban focus on the household level. Permaculture was conceived in the mid-1970s a decade before the sustainability concept was popularised by individualist pioneers. Common projects were often on what planners and architects call greenfield sites. Perhaps not so much in the French context, but certainly in Australia, people starting on a new piece of rural land and building from scratch, as we say. These pioneering individuals working to establish horticultural and architectural innovations in both family and intentional community contexts. Since those years, permaculture has grown and evolved into a worldwide movement across more than 100 countries with many different expressions and evolutions. Towns movement. Rob Hopkins, the founder of the transition movement, was a permaculture teacher and activist living the back to the land life at the Hollies community in rural Ireland when he invited me and Richard Heinberg, amongst many others, to a community conference at Kinsale, the conception place of the transition concept. The transition movement really took off with Rob's move to Totnes in southern England. Transition in Britain, Australia and around the world was about community building and resilience in existing, mostly urban localities, in response to the looming threats of climate change, peak oil and economic contraction. It focused on the people side of permaculture, while often using projects in the built and biological fields to achieve those ends. Retrosuburbia is building on the lessons of the permaculture pioneers, intentional communities and transition pounds to empower households to achieve their potential to live well now on less, while building resilience in response to accelerating and compounding challenges. Retrosuburban households are the essential building blocks for relocalised economies and self-governing communities. So why retrofitting? Most of the buildings in which we will face very different futures have already been built and will have to be retrofitted to suit. Maybe this is more obvious in a French context where people live in buildings that may be hundreds of years old. But in boom economy countries like Australia, where houses might only last one generation and be demolished to build apartments, this idea of rapid change and adaptation sometimes deludes people about how fast this process happens. In a contracting economy, in a difficult condition, all of that rate of change, of course, slows, if not grinds to a halt. Retrofitting can work through a live-learn cycle that is less dependent on scientific research, regulatory approval, or bank finance, and a pattern language of design solutions to recurring dilemmas or tensions helps create harmonious and functional habitats. And of course, this is not just in relation to the built environment. It applies, of course, in the ecological domain with gardening and animal husbandry, and of course, most rapidly in the way we can change our own behaviour and organisation of households. In Australia, I expected the bursting of the property bubble would trigger the second Great Depression that would force rapid growth of retrofitting and adaptive behaviour for more home-based living in larger shared households. So far, unprecedented government spending, debt and the lowest interest rates in the 5,000-year history of money have kept the property and stock market bubbles afloat. But the pandemic-induced home isolation has triggered an explosion of household self-reliance so large it has overwhelmed suppliers of seeds, tools and information. However, in Australia at least, the sense of emergency has transformed into a new grinding normality of lockdowns, control over private lives, waiting for vaccines to deliver some kind of hoped for salvation, and the resumption of debt-fueled consumption. Consequently, many have given up with the gardening and other expressions of household self-reliance. However, for a minority, the pandemic has been a wake-up call to deepen and extend those strategies. Further, a growing sense of disquiet about the emergence of permanent track and trace monitoring of people, work, travel, consumption restrictions, censorship of dissident perspectives on media and social media are leading some to prioritise autonomous, informal and non-monetary ways of providing for material and social needs. So why suburbia? It's where most people in countries like Australia live and have grown up. And it's a sweet point where lots of resources, both the biological and built domains, exist, and there's the ability to replicate solutions. The pandemic has highlighted the advantages relatively of suburban sprawl compared with inner city stacking. Lower infection risks, but enhanced community interaction with social distancing. Fewer lures to spend and consume, more space for home-based work and self-reliance, and more autonomy of infrastructure and options for retrofit. The concerns about infection reduced the attraction of inner-city public transport, while broadband internet, replacing the need to commute for many, tips the balance for many towards suburbia. So the first section of the book provides the introduction to the concept of resilience, energy descent, climate change, financial bubble. Pandemics and the responses taken by government were just one of the many wildcards that expose the vulnerability of our monetary economy based on global supply chains. Although the emergent details of the pandemic are unique, they illustrate in broad terms my brown tech energy descent scenario, in which crises that break the faith in market forces to provide solutions leads to the emergence of a command economy, where national governments use and strengthen the legal and extra-legal powers to reshape the economy and society. However, governments depend on the global corporations to implement these crisis-driven programs, which build on the already long-established pattern of disaster capitalism, making money from crises and dysfunction. While this context can be alarming in its implications, it only reinforces the logic informing the retro-suburban strategy. The household form and location matrix is a planning tool to assist individuals and households navigate the options relating to location and behaviour that will affect how we collectively survive and thrive challenging futures. Two tensions create four solution spaces that are more or less relevant to us depending on our personal circumstances and stage of life. The first tension is between the attraction to migrate somewhere new with better future prospects, or to consolidate our resources and knowledge in a space we know, shown on the horizontal axis. The second tension is between the will and capacity to develop and control a personal, household or communal space versus the imperative to accept unfolding realities by adaptation, including downshifting and disowning property and assets, shown in the vertical axis. The first solution space is perhaps the classic retro-suburban response, consolidating often in a multi-generation family home with substantial resilience retrofits and productive gardens. We call this solution space family castle. The second solution space, communal living, provides a greater degree of collective organisation and control over the living environment that often involves migration to a new place. Co-housing, eco-villages have all been influences in creating intentional communities, mostly in rural locations. The third space we call mobile minimalism. In Australia, characterised by young people who might be network nomads who reject lifelong debt to buy property but move between different spaces and connections, sometimes seasonally. The fourth space we call adapt in situ, staying connected to place and community you know, while adapting to change, whether that comes from outside circumstances or internal ones such as ageing. While this tool was crafted years ago, it feels even more relevant today in the context of the pandemic. Aussie Street is a story I've been telling for more than a decade. It's now written down as a chapter in Retro Suburbia and as a permaculture soap opera presentation that you can see on our website, aimed to connect with ordinary people living in the suburbs. Up until the turn of the millennium, Aussie Street follows the pattern of more built space housing fewer residents who spend more time away from home using public infrastructure and private facilities that also cover over more green and productive space while accelerating greenhouse gas emissions. After the permaculture pioneers of Retro Suburbia move in, the numbers improve, laying the groundwork for Aussie Street being a model of sustainability, resilience and livability in the second Great Depression of the 2020s. This simple story is also a challenge to academics to review the evidence, which I believe will expose the urban density meme as a cargo cult. That is, build more buildings and that will achieve population densities necessary for urban amenity and efficiency. Of course, in some ways this is a very Anglo-American, Australian context where our cities have had all these suburbs, low density suburbs with all of these problems that have seemed to be solved by if we could turn our cities into more European cities of medium density. The pandemic has shown how commuting to work is unnecessary for many people, that larger households and retrofitting of unneeded commercial real estate can solve the Australian housing crisis without the need to either infill suburban backyards, build over more agricultural land, or create more high-rise developments that of course are just great for spreading viruses. So Aussie Street is now our street, a picture book told from the perspective of one of the children in each decade of the story. It's written for 8 to 12 age group and features the work of Retro Suburbia illustrator Brenna Quinlan. Our street teaches the lived history of ordinary Australians in meaningful ways to empower the next generation so they can transform their home and street with or without the adults' approval. The 10 chapters of the built field cover shelter, heating, water, waste and other non-living aspects of our home environment. This beautiful yurt sits on in a suburban backyard as a movable tiny house. There it is with outside kitchen up against the neighbour's garage. The red line is where the fence has been taken down and the arrow points to a gate connecting to the neighbours in the next street. In cooler southern Australian climates, attached greenhouses to the sun side of the building are one of the best ways to reduce winter heating needs, grow early seedlings for summer and create halfway living spaces. Perhaps this is the most iconic permaculture retrofit for cool climates that can be adapted with variations to other climates. Outdoor living much of the year in Australian climates can reduce the sense of crowding, strengthen connections with nature and reduce the hold of media technology on children. The pandemic has highlighted how much safer and healthier it is to be outdoors, even ignoring the benefits of vitamin D from exposure to sunlight, which is shown to be a protective and recovery in COVID-19. Localized and high-tech energy, and can be carbon neutral and done in ways that are very fuel efficient with minimal smoke. This simple drum cook stove is even simpler and quicker to construct than a rocket stove, and almost as fuel efficient and smokeless, burning small stick fuel. The biological field covers growing food, raising livestock, and other biological aspects that make for an abundant and interesting living environment. This chart shows why the suburban scale between 100 and 1,000 square metres per residence is a sweet point of balance between three key limiting factors to food production, looking across 8 orders of magnitude in scale, from apartment balconies at one end to rangeland and forest at the other. At one extreme, sunlight limits what can be grown on a balcony or in a household window. At the other extreme, rainfall determines what grows. In the middle range, soil is the limiting factor. At suburban scale, all three factors are equally important, limiting, and capable of being optimised. Consequently, in high-density residential areas, it does make sense to aggregate limited growing space together in allotments. The more common historical European solution for people living in apartments to grow food, so that those allotments collectively are not so excessively shaded by buildings and trees. But allotment gardens are rarely as productive and efficient for the household economy as gardens attached to low-density residential housing. Anyone knows the efficiency of just nipping out from the kitchen to get something from the garden. More broadly, suburbia offers benign coastal climates and better than average soils, space for high-value perishable horticultural and small livestock products with low food miles and greenhouse gas emissions, storm water and grey water resources, waste food and human manure nutrient resources, and it conserves our best arable farmland for staple crops. And it provides high resilience to supply shocks in the centralised food system, and lays the foundation for household-led economic recovery without capital regulations or markets. The Plummery is a good case study of the potential productivity of garden agriculture at the smaller end of the suburban scale. Despite the limitations of space, soil contamination, and pest animals, this permaculture design system that includes quail and bees feeds the household the majority of its fresh food needs while generating surplus for barter. Kat Lavers runs sustainable gardening programs in local government and walks her talk at home a few hours a week to produce half a tonne of food from 100 square metres using permaculture design and organic methods of soil, plant and animal husbandry. Backyard animals provide a great focus for children, build empathetic connection to nature while providing services, manure and of course protein-rich foods. Well-designed systems can reduce the workload, improve animal welfare and prevent odours and waste from nutrients. The pandemic has highlighted the value of animals as companions in the context of less intimacy with friends, family and neighbours. The Australian history of suburban food production during the Great Depression of the 1930s showed that working class people with insecure tenure tended to keep animals that could be fed on weeds and wastes collected from common land. The pioneers of retro-suburbia are reinventing this use of the commons to boost backyard food production in what might still prove to be the Second Great Depression. While food trees are important elements of retro-suburban food systems, and the climatic and environmental benefits of trees are well known, there can also be conflicts that require management and even removal. Root pruning, uplift pruning, stem girdling, pollarding, as well as mounded and wicking beds are all options for containing trees in suburban food systems. But larger evergreen trees, especially eucalypts and pines, can be particularly problematic if not well located and managed, especially in our cooler climates where that sun access in winter is so important. Respectful reuse is often the best option, especially in the leafy suburbs where trees and possums can prevent food production, perhaps even worse than squirrels in parts of the Northern Hemisphere. The behavioural field addresses everything from home-based lifestyles and work, finance, raising self-reliant children, sustainable food habits, decision-making and conflict, health, ageing and disability, all the hard subjects. Larger households are really important to provide scale for many activities. Most households have too few people to be able to cover the skills of self-reliance, deal with crises and be economically efficient. Larger households can form in many different ways, including extended family, shared purchase, taking in boarders and volunteers, or even carers helping with the elderly. Eating locally and seasonally with less processed food, with minimal packaging, more veggies, less dairy and meat, is part of what we might call the retro-suburban diet. In the local context, I believe it's realistic for garden farming with some wild harvesting to provide 25 to 30% of a diverse, healthy diet, while intensive commercial, urban and peri-urban agriculture can provide a similar proportion. And then the bioregional hinterlands are best able to provide the remainder, especially grains, legumes and products from larger livestock. This diet is not so much a prescription, but what I believe might be an average that might emerge over time for people following this type of approach in the Southern Australian context. In other climates and contexts, the balance might be somewhat different. And certainly in rural areas in Australia, the balance would be somewhat different, especially more meat production, because in fact the environment in Australia spontaneously generates a wild abundance of animals, whereas of course urban areas don't do that as much. This ebook, Feeding Retro-Suburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion, you can download this from the Retro-Suburbian website. It wasn't included in Retro-Suburbia because it's really about my vision of a bioregional food system, but showing how what people do at the suburban scale can fit into that pattern. Hopefully this has given you a taste of how some Australian households are downshifting to deal with current and future challenges while enjoying the opportunities for more time with family, friends and nature, enriched neighbourhoods, a sense of security and hope for the future. The Retro Suburbia book is accessible online on a pay-what-you-feel basis from retrosuburbia.com. But to get the real 600-page, 1.8 kilo manual in your hand is a bit more complex because we boycott the global online supermarkets such as Amazon. Supporting independent publishing, distribution and retail helps create the world we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much.